Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? Welcome. I'm Amy Gottlieb, and I am deeply honored to be part of this distinguished group today, speaking with you all about closing the gender pay gap in medicine. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Professor of Medicine and OBGYN, so thank you for allowing me into your inner sanctum as a general internist. I'm also Chief Faculty Development Officer at Bay State Health. I'm going to take about 20 minutes and provide a brief overview of where we find ourselves in medicine around pay equity. For the first time in history, the number of women exceeds the number of men in U.S. medical schools. In fact, for 40 years, women have represented a significant proportion of med school graduates and currently account for almost half of medical students, graduate medical trainees, and faculty nationwide. Despite this workforce representation for decades, however, women continue to experience well-documented disparities in opportunity and compensation within medicine. These inequities are interrelated, and addressing one successfully necessarily implies understanding and mitigating the others. We can think of the gender pay gap as a crucible in which all the forces that diminish women's professional value within our medical institutions converge. The equity of opportunity that should be flowing from this numeric parity is unfortunately not materializing. Women's advancement in academic medicine looks like a funnel, with fewer and fewer women the higher one goes in seniority and leadership. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Weiler and colleagues just published their assessment of 5 years of data from the Association of Academic Chairs in Emergency Medicine and the Academy of Administrators in Academic Emergency Medicine. And what these investigators showed was that women held less departmental leadership overall and, strikingly, were least represented among executive leadership roles. Women also, when they did hold leadership, tended to do so in education, and not surprisingly, these roles were less compensated. In November of 2020, Kim Richter and her colleagues out at Kansas published really a landmark study in the New England Journal, which looked at about 600,000 medical school graduates among 134 U.S. medical schools over 35 years. And what these researchers demonstrated was when they compared the percentages of women who would be expected to be promoted on the basis of graduating rates with the actual percentage of women who were promoted academically, they showed that about 25% of women did not get promoted compared with their male colleagues. Additionally, and this is very striking, only 54% of the women who should have achieved chair status were promoted to that role. The disparity, unfortunately, for promotion from associate to full professor got worse over the 35-year period. So in addition to gender disparities in achieving senior rank and organizational leadership, the data consistently show that women in medicine and science receive less research support and lower compensation. And these data, it's very important for me to be explicit, exist even after accounting for numerous confounders like age and experience, specialty, productivity, and professional commitment. It's really important for me at this juncture as well to point out that the literature shows that women of color experience even greater disparities in these domains and face considerable barriers to advancement. So now I'd like to turn specifically to the compensation data. In this country, women physicians earn 72 cents on the dollar compared with their equally talented male counterparts. Women faculty in medicine and science earn less than men in every specialty and at every academic rank. In fact, women physicians experience one of the largest gender pay gaps in the US labor market, and the data are consistent that these inequities begin right out of training. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Association of American Medical Colleges annual faculty salary survey. In this effort, the AAMC collects and publishes data on about 120,000 medical school faculty salaries every year. In 2019, the AAMC analyzed and published this data for the first time broken down by gender. Just last October, in October of 2021, the AAMC published this data by both gender and race and ethnicity. And so we now have the opportunity in our profession to look at compensation trends and gaps in medicine through an intersectional lens. This groundbreaking report reflected 98,000 faculty salaries and revealed that the biggest gender pay gap occurred among physician faculty in clinical departments. Among these faculty, women were paid between 67 and 77 cents on the dollar compared with white men, and women, regardless of race, were shown to earn less than men of every race. This phenomenon holds true in emergency medicine, where women earn 89 cents to 94 cents on the dollar compared with white men, and less than men in every race and ethnicity. So there are multiple inflection points in women's career trajectories where our traditional way of paying folks, of valuing the work that they do, disproportionately rewards the way men, faculty, and physicians have been working and living for generations. And so now I'd like to take some time to unpack and explore traditional compensation methodology within medicine. Consider that compensation methodology typically rests on a formula of base salary determined by commercially available benchmarking data, plus additional monetary reward for rank, leadership, and productivity. If the goal is total cash compensation, we can see how common compensation methodology contributes structurally to gender-based salary inequities because of women's diminished earning potential in each domain. For example, regarding base salary, there's often a considerable difference between the dollar amounts of the low and high ends of the benchmark ranges, allowing organizations wide berth in determining compensation. Salary expectations and vigorousness of negotiation during initial hire are critical to establishing where an individual falls in that target range and are potentially vulnerable to gender bias. Productivity-based compensation is impacted negatively by increased demands on women for organizational service, increased time spent with patients, resulting in better outcomes but lower volumes, and greater responsibilities for domestic duties compared with male colleagues. Similarly, limited formal leadership roles and less sponsorship for those opportunities diminish women's access to the leadership premium in pay that often accrues to these experiences. So I'd like to explore a few of these elements individually. In order to do so, I'll need to describe the phenomenon known as second-generation gender bias. So second-generation gender bias is different from the sexism that existed pre-Title VII and pre-Title IX in that there's not an overt intention to exclude. Instead, these biases are embedded in our expectations and unconscious stereotypes about what leaders look like, how men and women should behave, and how women's work is assigned and valued. These prescriptive societal and organizational norms are truly the engines behind why our talented women are failing to reach their professional potential and being paid less. Specifically, they are the drivers of the gendered career paths we see in medicine, of the consistent observation that women spend more time on non-promotable tasks in our organizations and experience backlash when leading and negotiating. Research reveals that within healthcare, on both the academic and the business sides of the house, women tend to advance in areas that are consultative or supportive versus those that have significant quantitative or managerial responsibility. So in academic medicine, as an example, women who advance to decanal roles tend to do so in faculty affairs versus research or clinical affairs. You all from Bay State will recognize pre-COVID hair, that's me, and my husband, actually, who's the Associate Dean for Research. Furthermore, there is emerging evidence that women trainees continue to be directed towards certain specialties like pediatrics that require traditionally feminine attributes and away from more technical or procedural ones like orthopedics. This phenomenon is called occupational gender segregation, and it has tremendous consequences for pay equity. In the U.S. labor market writ large, a loss of prestige and a decline in earnings have been shown to occur after a large number of women enter a field or profession. So when an entire specialty loses ground in terms of relative compensation, that's reflected in the benchmarks and the salary benchmarks that we use, the earning potential of an entire specialty and all the women who are entering that specialty is put at considerable risk. Another manifestation of second-generation gender bias, as I mentioned, is that women have been shown to spend more time on non-promotable tasks. This is work that has little visibility or impact. It's work that benefits the organization for sure, but doesn't contribute necessarily to performance evaluation or metrics for advancement. This is institutional housework, and the types of work vary by industry, but they're readily identified. There's actually some very interesting research around volunteerism for women in mixed gender groups, which shows that women in that setting are more likely to volunteer than men, receive more requests to volunteer than men, and are more likely to say yes when asked to volunteer. So there's this implicit understanding that women will raise their hands in our organizations for these citizenship-like tasks. I'd like to talk next about the double binds that women face when trying to advance in their careers and when behaving like traditional leaders. Implicit expectations around women's behavior organizationally and in society writ large are often at odds with well-accepted, desirable leadership traits. So, for example, women are expected to be directive yet participative, decisive yet caring, executive yet approachable. What's driving this phenomenon? Well, there are long-standing, long-held cultural expectations, societal norms that women are to be nice and caretaking and other-focused, whereas leaders and high performers are expected to be decisive, assertive, and independent. And there is a very well-described backlash when one's behavior violates these gender stereotypes. There is a social penalty in the workplace for women who behave like traditional leaders, and this impacts how they're described and evaluated, and it dictates how effectively they can self-advocate and lead. This likability paradox was described nicely in a study, or a review of a study, published in Harvard Business Review in 2018. In this investigation, researchers looked at 81,000 performance evaluations, both men and women, at the U.S. Naval Academy. And what these investigators showed was that women were evaluated more negatively than their male counterparts, despite no differences in objective measures such as grades, fitness scores, and class standing. Additionally, women were judged less competent than men of equal qualification and were assigned more negative attributes. The most commonly assigned positive term for men was analytical. For women, it was compassionate. Now, you may say analytical, compassionate, those are both positive. However, what is more valuable from an organizational standpoint? Analytical is task-oriented. It speaks to an individual's ability to reason, to interpret, to strategize. So when considering whom to hire, whom to promote, whom to compensate, which person, which attribute is going to take the prize? Turning to negotiation, it's important to acknowledge that at its essence, a job negotiation is really an interpersonal exchange between a job seeker and an evaluator. And the data show that job seekers who violate unconscious stereotypes experience backlash. Particularly, negotiating salary has been shown to significantly decrease hireability, that was the term used in the study, for women candidates, and that male evaluators in particular penalize women who negotiate. So men and women truly do face different costs when deciding whether or not to initiate salary negotiations. In sum, women face a unique professional challenge of having this implicit background identity that they have to, of unconscious social expectations around their behavior that they have to navigate. There's a cultural context in which women have to battle the expectations of being feminine while at the same time fulfilling requisites of advancement and leadership. And this is costly psychologically, and the data show results in self-censorship and attrition with tremendous consequences for pay equity. It's also a suboptimal business model because if you think about it, our organizations really do need to be harnessing the talents of their entire bench. So as we consider how elements of second-generation gender bias can undermine the equity in the productivity domain of our traditional compensation calculus, we really don't need to look any further than the pandemic. The data show consistently that women in medicine and science have indeed been doing more double shift work during the pandemic, and specifically performing more household duties and childcare compared with their male colleagues, and not surprisingly demonstrating lower productivity academically. So I'd like to switch tacks a little bit to talk very briefly about organizational strategies to close the gender pay gap in medicine. Let's peel back the onion a little bit. While it's critical that we address the cultural context in which the gender pay gap in medicine emerges, it's also necessary to recognize that closing the gender pay gap is a business endeavor, meriting the same attention to detail and rigor afforded other operating costs. We are going to need to engage our HR and finance colleagues to take a good, hard look at the basic assumptions underlying traditional compensation methodologies to understand the expectations and the outcomes they generate, to create new approaches that better account for the unique contributions of women and the biases facing them, and to track and report gender metrics at all compensation touch points. So a few colleagues of mine and I, just about a year and a half ago, published a book that aims to help institutions with this endeavor, a roadmap, so to speak. And so if you're interested to learn more, I've put up the link here. In the last minute or so, I would like to emphasize the importance of culture change to this endeavor, closing the gender pay gap. What we're really talking about here is building cultures in which men and women are not limited by role expectations. And this effort truly does begin with ourselves, with reflection about our own decision-making and our own perceptions. We have to be mindful of the language we use in our introductions and our valuations. Linguistic biases implicitly communicate gender stereotypes and contribute to the maintenance of gender norms that women have less standing and less expertise. As I'm sure many of you know, there's a lot of evidence that women physicians in particular, are introduced with their professional titles considerably less often than their male colleagues and are evaluated with fewer standout adjectives despite similar qualifications. We need to be sponsoring high potential women for leadership opportunities and paying attention to the processes in which unconscious biases can and do unfold. So recruiting, hiring, compensation, evaluation, and promotion. And if folks are not already doing so, in the vein of paying attention, we can only manage what we measure. So we should be tracking gender representation across the career continuum and conducting regular salary audits, particularly for initial hires. Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tala Elia.
Thanks, Amy. And we're going to now talk a little bit about the experience of 3 different departments and institutions and how we sort of started undertaking this work. At our department, we started looking at a process for salary analysis a few years ago. And the way it started was a couple of my colleagues, a couple of our faculty members actually went to a conference where they heard a talk about salary transparency. And they came back, and we were discussing, and I said, hey, is this something we can do in our department? I had recently taken on a new leadership role, and I went to our chair over there and said, hey, okay, is this something we can do? And we took it to HR, and the first answer was, no, we can't. We can't publish people's salaries. We can't release personal information. We said, well, how about if we do this analysis as a department? We take a look at these numbers, put together analysis, and share that with our faculty. And we got the go-ahead. So that's what we started to do. And what we first did was take a look at our salary structure. And the way our salary structure is, there's 4 tiers where people fall into. And people start in general at the C level, at the entry level, and then progress in somewhat of an automatic fashion to the B level because it involves appointment to assistant professor plus 3 years of experience. And then there's a little bit more of a leap to B plus level where you need promotion to associate professor or a leadership position. And then the highest tier is the A level, which involves full professor, a really significant leadership role. And so knowing this was our salary structure, we had 2 questions when we first took this analysis. And the first was, within each of these levels, are the salaries equitable? And then, are women progressing as equitably as men throughout from one level to another? And a couple things to note about the analysis, a couple caveats and limitations. All salaries were corrected to 1 FTE, so we were looking at apples and apples, and we were looking at base salary. We didn't look at, we didn't include the PEM, the pediatric EM faculty, or the chairs or vice chairs, as they had a different salary structure. And because of our numbers, we were unfortunately unable to do a race-based analysis and keep it anonymized. It was limited to gender. So when we looked at it the first year, which was 2019, looking at the individual salary levels, we found that salaries were actually equal. There was really no discrepancy between men and women in each of the salary tiers. And then we looked at the breakdown of who was in each of these tiers. And what we found was that in those entry level, those first 2 lower tiers, it was pretty equal. And then as you looked at progression, it really dropped off pretty significantly to those B plus and A higher levels, and where you had no women in the B plus and very few women in the A level. And so we said, well, what's behind this? What are some of the confounders? And one thing we did recognize was that in our department, if you look back, about 15 years ago, it was a really predominantly male department, and our hiring practice had evened out, and in the last 10 years, we'd hired a large number of female physicians as opposed to prior to that. And so when you looked at the years of practice in our department, for the men and the male physicians in the department, it was about 13 years of practice on average, where the women in the department had about 7.5 years of practice. And then when we overlaid that, looking at the years of service, years of practice, in each of those salary tiers, what we saw was in that B level, men and women both had about average 8 years of experience. And then when we looked at that B plus level, the physicians in that level had been practicing for about 11 years. So what we saw, and remember, our female faculty at this point had an average of 7.5 years. So we realized we're really at a pivotal point here. This is the time where we really should see our female physicians progressing into that B+ bucket. So what we really said was this is something we need to do on an ongoing, regular basis, because we're really at this pivotal point where we should see progression, and if not, why not? And this is a really time where we can actually scrutinize what we're doing going forward. So as we looked at, we repeated this analysis the next year, and we saw this time that, again, in each tier, salaries were equal. There wasn't discrepancy between one tier and another. And when we took a look at the progression this year, we did see that women had actually started to progress to that B+ level. We went from 0 to 38% women, but did not have changes yet in that A-level salary. So really the benefits that this analysis brought us, and I should say here that the intention was to repeat this annually, and COVID threw a bit of a wrench in that, so we had a hiatus for the last couple of years, but we're actually undertaking this, the next salary analysis in the next month. So we'll be looking at that going forward and expect to see some progression to A level. And really the benefits of the salary was it really brought an awareness of what salary promotion opportunities was, what the factors were, and allowed for that advocacy both on an individual level and a chair level. It allowed for recognition of leadership roles, former leadership roles, and also what leadership roles sort of qualify to fall into those A, B+, and A buckets, and are those being adequately compensated? And really it brought to light that ongoing analysis is key to follow this to be effective. So I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Temin.
Thank you. So similarly to Dr. Ilya, in 2019, I was getting ready for my annual review, and it seemed to be a time when this was a hot topic in just the lay news. So I was reading about this in the New York Times and on social media, and so I walked into my review with my chair, and I said, hey, there's a lot of talk about how women don't make as much money as men in medicine in general, and I have no idea where I stand in my department. I don't know anyone else's salary. I don't know if I'm making a good salary or not, and so I actually picked one of my male colleagues who'd been hired within a year or so of myself, who had kind of similar leadership roles, didn't have a fellowship behind him, but kind of was ballpark. And I said, I think I should be making as much or a little more as this person. And my chair said, oh, interesting, okay, I will look at this. And to his credit, he followed through and did do an analysis at that point. I don't think he checked it with HR. I don't know, but we'll see. It was only within our department. But even without the kind of leadership role that Dr. Ilya has, I was just like, is this a thing? I don't know where I am, and how do we go forward with this? Just for a little bit of background, our salaries in our department were determined by our chair after the department makes margin. His goal was the 70th percentile of the SAEM data. And he had many years ago kind of created a standardized salary increase for academic rank, for certain leadership roles, and for some educational roles as well. The data that I'll present to you also excludes chair and our executive vice chair, but does include the rest of our vice chairs. It does exclude non-clinical faculty and all of our pediatric faculty. And it includes, for our initial assessment, was 40 faculty, and for the second was 48. And so this looks at base salary plus kind of these standardized bonuses. I will just note that at Harvard, being Harvard, unless you come in as a associate or full professor, you're hired as an instructor, not as an assistant professor, and you have to promote to assistant professor as well. So in looking at our data, we looked at it in 2019, and then recently, again, our chair has looked at it, but in terms of when it was given to us in 2019, and then again in 2022. So you can see, let's see, what's on there. So you can see that obviously we have more men than women in the department. We're at about kind of a third or so of our department is women. We're pretty close to equal when in 2019 when you start with instructor and assistant professor. And then, like the national data, like the data at Bay State, once you get to associate professor and full professor, there is a much greater discrepancy. Over the years, I'll go into some of the interventions, but the goal was then to try and bring some of these women into this higher academic rank, which has been done with some success, but also for men as well. So we also looked at our salary per academic rank per gender. And fortunately, our salary within each academic rank was pretty equal, which was great to see. Our initial assessment in 2019, instructor and assistant were together, and then obviously in professor we had nothing in the women's side. When you look at 2022, again, we have worked hard to try and increase the number of women in higher academic ranks, and so those numbers look a little bit better, and again, fortunately, the salaries themselves stayed equal. Again, still no one in the professor rank. So I also looked at years of service, kind of prompted by Dr. Ilia's look, and to see kind of where that stood for us and how that would impact what was going on here. And we've done a pretty good job of pulling people from instructor up to the assistant professor, but our years, we actually have less years of service for women in each level and men, and I think that that is a product of our leadership trying to pull women that they think are appropriate for higher levels up to the next rank. So I think that is a good sign in our department. I also looked at leadership roles because we know more leadership roles give, for this case, higher salary, but also give you more clout to be promoted in academic rank as well. So when we looked at our primary leadership, so chair, vice chair, our program directors, in 2019 it was 100% men. And in 2022, we did bring some women. We increased our male numbers by 1, but did increase our women in those roles as well. Our secondary leadership roles, so things like division chiefs, chiefs of centers, QA chairs, again, it was kind of a 3-to-1 or so male to female, and that we've tried to increase those numbers. Again, the ratio hasn't changed significantly. So looking at the goals of kind of how we were going to intervene here and what our goals were to improve this access for our women faculty, is we found that our salaries per each rank were very equal. So that wasn't the area to intervene, right? So the areas to intervene were how do we increase our gender equity at higher academic ranks and in leadership roles, and those were then to be the goals for the department. So some of the things that our chair had done was to actively recruit women for leadership roles within the department, to put a more robust process in place to support women in the promotion process, and that has been very effective and has been excellent. And then we also have a women's group that we had started in our department pre-COVID to look at academic productivity, and it was an time where we would get together and talk about academic projects. We were able to troubleshoot for each other, to kind of help each other with questions. If someone needed, someone was having trouble hiring an RA, what are the questions you would ask to help them? If someone needed a financial analysis, who was the person to go to? So it was a way to kind of help people attain more of those intangibles that are needed then for academic promotion. And we actually, there are multiple Harvard hospitals, and we actually recently published through a group associated with AWEM a paper last year that looked at a kind of multidisciplinary, a Harvard-wide system of women's groups and supporting each other throughout the different Harvard hospitals, not just within our own hospital. So that was kind of an additional step that we could do as well. So I'm now going to step down.
Great. So I'm Sharon Chikijan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm at Yale, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the institutional approach that we've taken at Yale, so less of a departmental basis. And then we're going to move on to questions after that, so I will not torture you with too much data. So at Yale, basically, what we did was we advocated for institutional and systemic change. And I think it's really important because the question of whether this is a matter of equity and fairness versus whether this is a good business model is, always comes up. And I think I would argue that it's really a matter of both. As Dr. Gottlieb said, coming from a business background, you want to play everybody on your bench. You want to maximize, to their greatest potential, every single person that's on your team. And this has really been an issue that's been highlighted in the press. It's estimated that each physician who turns over can cost anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million in terms of catching up, onboarding a new person. And that has a huge cost, actually, nationally of $4.9 billion a year. So this is a huge, huge issue. And so Yale decided to undertake this work in, believe it or not, 2016, so not that long ago. And the impetus was really not about equity. The impetus was about not getting sued, to be honest. There was a famous case. It's true. And I don't know how many people have heard about Lilly Ledbetter. So Lilly Ledbetter, so one person in the audience has heard of it, and this is, three, okay, good. So this is kind of a landmark case. A woman named Lilly Ledbetter in 2007 successfully won a lawsuit against Goodyear Tire. And she was a supervisor at the plant, and she had no idea that for years she was being underpaid. And she actually received an anonymous letter, it's pretty fascinating, in her mailbox at work, like about a month before she retired. And the letter said, you have been underpaid compared to other supervisors, male supervisors here at Goodyear, to the tune of about 40% less. So she launched a lawsuit soon thereafter. She won the lawsuit, actually. And I just want to make a note, too, like that seems shocking to you, you all gasped, but Dr. Gottlieb just said that we're making, on average, as physicians, about 25% less than our male counterparts. So we should be equally shocked. She won that case. It went on to an appeals, and it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and she lost. So she was not given that compensation because the law stipulated that if you had an issue with compensation and inequity, that you had to file a complaint within 180 days of knowing about the inequity. And because she had been working for many years, they argued that she had accepted the salary. This resulted in a law that changed, and now, up until the last paycheck, you have 180 days to actually lodge your complaint. So anyhow, a little divergence, but I thought it was interesting. So Yale, kind of looked at this. It took quite a few years before they actually became alarmed about it. But they said, we do not want to be in a position where we haven't addressed this going forward, and we might have lawsuits on our hands. So what they did was they came up with this annual compensation model and a review process. And Dr. Gottlieb told me this is actually sort of an earlier version of what she was working out before her New England Journal article came out. But essentially, what we looked at was total compensation in every department and at every rank. And I say total compensation because base salaries are a little bit tricky because they are, really compensated for by bonuses, et cetera. So what you want to look at is total compensation. And there were 4 buckets that sort of went into this compensation model. There's education, productivity, position or rank, and other demographics, and one was a female indicator. And so what Yale decided to do was every year they were going to run this regression model. They tweaked it every year, and then Dean Alpern, who was the dean at the time and no longer our dean now, sat down to meet with actually 40 different chairs, and he went through 1,900 faculty members, both members of basic science faculty and clinical science. And so in attendance were a lot of other deans, people from the compensation department, And they included all ladder and senior research faculty in the review. This always happens in the spring. And there are 3 data analysts that are assigned to this process, which is like a huge undertaking. So when he sat down to review materials with everybody, these are the materials that were brought to the table. So each chair is responsible, and this is an enormous amount of work, so you can ask Dr. D'Onofrio, who did this work. This was no small feat, and basically they had to be prepared to defend the salary for every single person. And so you can see the meeting materials included years in rank, current salary, recommended salary for the incoming fiscal year, variable compensation, so that's that other chunk in addition to your base salary that makes up your total compensation, gender, race, and ethnicity, if available, the residual value from the regression model, research and performance metrics, and leadership roles that are brought to the table. And so all of these, each faculty member was discussed, and if there were any outliers, then the salary needed to be defended. So, did this person have a significant role or significant time commitment that justified the salary being an outlier on the bell curve? Did they work a lot of overtime? So all those things were actually really broken down. And what they found was no matter what they did, every year there was creep, and every year there was inequity within that bell curve. I've actually received 2 adjustments, believe it or not, in the course of the last 6 years. So it's been kind of enlightening to me, but I never received an adjustment going back for those years where my salary was probably grossly unequal. So this also, I just wanted to show you what we receive at the end of our year and before the new year comes up. So what we do is we look at, and this is all coming from the dean's office, but each chair is responsible for distributing this sort of report card. And what it shows is your salary. So this one comes from anesthesia, so nobody will be upset. You can see in the upper right corner, there's academic rank. So this person's an assistant professor. The years in rank were 2.5 years. Their specialty is anesthesia. Their benchmarking is as an MD, not as an MD PhD or a PhD. Annual salary was $295,000, and their variable compensation or bonus was $24,000. So their total compensation for the year of 2018 was $319,000. And then this is the key. So what you really want to do is make sure you're benchmarking against something that is valid. So, you might be equal to somebody in your department, but you might all be underpaid. So at Yale, the goal was really to get everybody to the 50th percentile of the double AMC salary rankings for the Northeast. And double AMC looks at total compensation, not base salary. And it goes all the way from instructor all the way up to full professor position. So you can see that this person, and it says right here, is paid between the 25th and the 50th percentiles. So a little bit low in terms of what our goal is. Then coming down here, these are all benchmarks at the School of Medicine. So this person, for their peer group of faculty, who generally range from 1 to 10 years of experience in that role, is in the 75th percentile in the peer group for annual salary. So this doesn't include total compensation. So that's looking really good. But when total compensation is taken into an account, it's between 50th and 75th percentile. So they drop down a little bit, but still within the goal. So we get this every year now, and it's somewhat comforting to know that there is, benchmarking going on. Like I said, this is reviewed every year, and I think that's really a key point. And Dr. Gottlieb had raised that in our discussions, and this is really like, we could make this akin to the process of QI, where you're really looking at your numbers, but then you're going back and you're saying, are we improving? Did something creep in? Are we now off of our target? So I just offer that as an example of what can happen at an institutional level, and that's obviously preferable to having to go, in a very personal way, like Dr. Elia and Dr. Temin just demonstrated, to a chair as an individual to say, hey, is my salary fair? So it's nice to not have to have that conversation each time. And it certainly goes a far way, I think, towards ensuring equity. But of course, we have in every one of those 4 buckets that we just looked at this possible generation of a second generation bias. And I think all of those things need to be examined as well. So I will close and we will take any questions. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, Dr. Elia is going to come back and just wrap up our recommendations, and then we'll take questions.
So just a little bit of a summary of where we are. We've really clearly established, and everyone knows that this problem is systemic, but there are ways to start with local action. And salary analysis, transparency, and cascaded communication, really focusing on formal leadership and academic promotion, can be implemented on a department level or institution level. Paying attention to salary equity right out of training is critical, and really also focusing on academic promotion as a way to drive pay equity, and then inclusive sponsorship as another tool to support advancement, are tools that we can really use to advance these issues. And then ongoing analysis and action is really critical, again, similar to a QI process or process improvement system. You don't do an intervention and then leave it alone. You have to continuously go back and see how are you trending, how are things happening, and really just to drive the point home on what the impact of this is. This study was in JAMA and looked at starting salaries. It looked at salaries based on discrepancies in AMC and looked at what the net present value was when had salaries been equalized from the gate. And really, when you're looking at graduating trainees, there's not really a rationalizable reason why you have salary discrepancies from the start. And when they looked at men versus women, start with a salary discrepancy at the start and then projected what their net present value are 10 years out because of that initial discrepancy, the numbers in terms of that 10-year difference in value were hundreds of thousands of dollars. They grouped them by adult medical, adult surgical, pediatric medical, and the ranges were anywhere from $100,000 to almost $600,000 in that 10-year period of lost value. And there were similar gaps, less dramatic, in terms of delayed promotion, but in this analysis looked at 1 year in delay from assistant professor to associate professor, and then looked at that 10-year difference. And again, there are tens of thousands, $20,000 to $50,000 of difference in that 10-year lost of net present value. So really, gaps in promotion can also have a big financial impact. It's really driving home the real implications of this. So we'll open it up now to any questions people might have.
Hi, I'm so we're famously known to have standard salaries based on how many years you're out and on your specialty. So we did a similar analysis in 2019, but instead of looking at, we incorporated salaries because we all are basically being the same, there was no variability. But we looked at leadership positions sort of like we did at Harvard. But then our other form of currency that we looked at was protected time. And we found great disparity in protected time. And that's what gives you the time to do other things, right, to get to these leadership positions. So that's another thing I plan to see if you're going to do this analysis, look at that.
Can I ask you a question, Dr. Rocker? So that study that Neha is referring to, in my larger talk, I always refer to, because the other piece that they found was the difference in compensable leadership roles and occupational gender segregation. There were more men in the highly remunerated specialty. But was that data published about the protected time? That's very interesting. In the same, was it Sharon Hayes also who did it?
Sharon's on paper.
Yeah. So it's total rewards is kind of what Neha is getting at, right? It's not just salary. Yeah, that's good.
Danielle Carthy, Northwestern. You mentioned at Yale sort of a motivating factor being the fear of the lawsuits. I think oftentimes we find that it's often motivating to be able to say we are doing what our peer institutions are doing. And so I'm wondering if Yale has published their system or if there are other things out there that we can take to our institutions to say these are what our peer institutions are doing and we can rise to do this.
Yeah, no, it actually has not been published. It's been presented at the AAMC, and we hope to actually present this at the chairs meeting next year. I think it's really timely right now, and it certainly gives a very nice standardized model. I don't know if you have any other comments.
I think your point about institutional risk is really critical, so I want to just amplify that. As you all probably know, there are federal laws that we referred to, but there are also state laws around pay equity, and depending on the state where you live, this issue could be addressed. Kind of what you're talking about is a safe harbor provision for institutions that are undertaking salary equity, and then they're somewhat protected from being sued, essentially, if they can show due diligence around this. And it's actually something that's very important to keep in your arsenal when you advocate for salary audits, because I will tell you anecdotally, and I speak all over the country about closing the gender pay gap, this is probably one of the top pieces of concern that institutions voice around dipping their toe into the water of salary equity. So look at your state statutes as well as the federal ones around this.
Oh, question in the back and then up here.
My name's Julian Suzanne from Henry Ford Hospital. Thanks very much. You mentioned like the kind of traditional promotional tracks where it's either research or it's administrative roles. Have any of your institutions or any of your departments explored alternative means of promotions, like rewarding things like arts in medicine or wellness work, things like that, social media outputs, things that don't often hit high on your CV?
I just have one comment about that. Our regression model, notably, all the folks that worked on it that I spoke with said that there was no compensation or dispensation for good citizenship or for efforts like that. And obviously those are areas where women are frequently, volunteered, auto-volunteered, et cetera. So there's still that piece that's missing.
I will say also that it's only been in the past 5 years or so that Harvard has even taken the clinical tract as being important, as opposed to not just the research. So the fact of looking at art and support and wellness is, I'm sure, not even a discussion yet.
Great question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really great presentations. I had a question about retention. So much has been written about mid-career women leaving academia altogether. And so as you all look at all of this and obviously trying to get folks to leadership levels and looking at pay equity, which plays into why women leave, have you looked at that as well, your ability to retain talented folks, especially when you're talking about losing $500,000 to minimum faculty, probably even more so if you look at folks that are at that point in their career.
Yeah, I think this is a discussion we've sort of had ongoing and a discussion out there, absolutely. And I don't think there are easy answers. I think a lot of the factors that play into this lack of progression also play into lack of retention. And these problems are systemic. It's hard to address them on an individual level because a lot of the biases that play into these factors that we talked about also play into the same reasons that women are leaving. Mm-hmm. So again, it's something I think that needs to be addressed at a systemic level, and there's departmental scrutiny, obviously, that can happen that can address some of these bias issues that may mitigate that, but also may not, given the current stressors. So,
I think these are some great strategies that we're proposing, so thank you very much. I'm Nita Duana from Springfield, Illinois, Southern Illinois University. My question was, with the role, I saw one of the slides that there was a difference between primary leadership role and secondary. Now, is there a difference in the pay or the number that's attached to those? Because I would say that the sample of the primary was more like, I would say, more of the male roles, whereas the females is more the secondary. And so I'm just curious about number difference in salary.
Yes, so there is. There tried to be a standardized salary within each of those buckets, or salary increase within each of those buckets, but they were not comparable to each other. So primary kind of had a standardized increase, secondary had a standardized increase. But if you saw, even within those, both of them were more male-oriented, and it's been, there really needed to be a conscious effort to kind of bring women into that. And I think that the trend was really optimistic, and both of those trended to have more women, but it was early in the process. We've only looked at 2 data points, and the hope is that as we look forward, that will increase within each of those, but each one is a separate bucket.
And I think you uncovered a really important second-generation bias, and so, all the leaders in this room, think about when you're hiring for a position, putting it out there for all interested parties, and then really making sure that you're reconsidering your decisions at every step.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm also from Springfield. I'm just a medical student, so it's
But one of you mentioned that there's decreased hireability with women who are negotiating their salaries. So how do we help that moving forward by being able to be assertive but not decreasing our likelihood of being hired?
So that's a talk unto itself. It's an excellent question, and in all honesty, I think what you're all probably getting from this presentation is that we're systems-based change individuals, and our work is around organizational change. And on a personal note, I strongly believe that there's really nothing that an individual candidate at the time of hire can do to affect all the kind of gender bias and barriers set up in an institution. That being said, on an individual level, the most important thing or effort one can make to close the gender pay gap for oneself is to understand the playing field, the rules of the game. And what that means is you need to understand what the benchmarks are that your target institution is using, what are the target ranges around that benchmark, and what are the metrics for placement within those ranges. And then the best piece of advice I ever got around negotiating salary was to treat it as if you're having a conversation about the methods section of a journal article, because that takes it from the personal to the objective. So you can say, so tell me, help me understand where that p-value came from. Help me understand what the benchmark is and the target range and the metrics for placement in that. And so, again, we need to change this as institutions, but on an individual level, knowing your worth through those objective data, it's critical.
Question back there.
Hi, Chad Miller from Linguistic Biases. I'd love to hear a little bit of discussion around the adjustment for FTE, because that is also a place where it's biased.
I think that's what Neha was getting at. I think that was what Dr. Rockar was getting at. Are you, Neha, about that kind of adjustment of protected time and FTE, or do you mean within the studies?
Yeah.
Part-time.
So the salaries themselves were, if someone was 80%, their salary was adjusted up to what it would be if they worked full time, and then it was compared on that level, so that we actually in our department have, but I don't have the slides here, but do have male and female physicians that are part time, and neither of those were confounders in bringing that gross number down of salary when comparing in each tier level. And so that's why they were adjusted to 1.0, what the salary would be if each person was at 1.0 and compared at that level.
And all the salary data that I quote has been adjusted for part-time. That's an old cultural narrative that women work part-time and that's why we get paid less. It's always adjusted for, at least in the literature from the last 20 years.
Great talk. Anytime I see a talk on gender bias and pay gaps, one of my questions is, what about for those that are gender minorities, like they're gender expansive? I look at this and I wonder, is that the next step, and do we know anything about that group? Because there's a lot of gender bias there, and whether it's hiring and recruitment and retention in academic positions for people that may have, presentations that don't align with professional, benchmarks.
I think that's a great question, and I can tell you I do a lot of work with the AAMC, and this is a conversation that, they are just data collection machines and trying to understand how best to qualify and quantify the very important and growing group of folks who are gender non-binary, gender fluid, and how that impacts advancement and pay. And so right now that data does not exist, to my knowledge, on a national level, and so that's problematic for benchmarking, right?
I think there's one more. Yep.
How do we get male buy-in to this problem? Like, it's great that there are males in the audience, but the group I was just with was a group of males. They didn't want to come to this talk. I don't know if it's because they feel like, A, it's not my problem, or I think some of them feel like it's not real. And even just like anecdotally, the show, Grey's Anatomy, like that lead actress, she was getting paid much less than Patrick Dempsey. She went to Patrick Dempsey and said, come with me to ABC, support me that we should be paid equal. I am also the star of the show.
I mean, I think
You're welcome to feel that tall.
Yeah. I think that's going to be on an individual level. There's some people that are willing to ally, and others, as you're saying, are not. And I think honestly, the change has to come from a little higher than that. I think we need to get buy-in from our chairs and our leaders at the minimal level. Getting an institutional buy-in is great. There's still things we can do at a department level that we've shown, and it's going to chairs and leadership within those levels. And I guess I don't have advice on how to, if you don't have someone who's supportive of it other than having it not be one individual. Are there people within your faculty that are willing to sort of come up with a proposal, say these, come and say, hey, these institutions have done this, show comparisons of what other places have done. That's part of our goal here, is people can go back and say, hey, I saw that, Yale's doing this, and MGH is doing this, and Bay State is doing this. That we're not out there in the Wild West doing something crazy. Like the other institutions are doing this, and let's not fall behind.
Yeah, I think the more we can stay away from, from personal relationships and one-off readjustments, the better. This really needs to be institutional change and national change. So involving the AAMC, at sort of helping with directives and standardizing this as much as possible would probably be the best way to do this. Of course, there are always these biases that enter.
I also want to acknowledge that what you're describing is very real, and it's not. It's not some. I mean, it's disappointing, but I also think that that this is an issue that impacts the field, right? And certainly in those one-off moments, that's the tack that I do and would take, which is that this is not. I mean, it's a gender pay gap, but it's not a gender issue, right? I mean, this is half the workforce, and so.
I just want to highlight that because I know we need to leave because the next group needs to come in, but that this doesn't need to be, hey, this is a good guy and he's going to stand up for me, right? This is financial. This is purely objective financial. You are not using your workforce well. You are getting decreased productivity. You're getting increased financial burden because of turnover. Like, this can be totally turned into a financial question and process, and that is what everyone will respond to regardless of their personal biases.
It's good business.
Yeah. Can we take?
So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Yeah.
I will stand up for you. I'm a male. I was actually going to ask a follow-up question. Have you compared institutions where there's a high proportion of female in leadership roles?
Yes, So not in medicine, but in higher education, there is data that universities that have a female president have a smaller gender pay gap and more women in kind of that second-tier leadership roles. So that's an excellent point. What we also need, all of you in the room, need to get into the highest leadership positions.